Welcome to our Harbor from the Holocaust preview. I'm Jim Cunningham from WQED, and it is a joy to have you with us. We have a terrific panel, and I hope you'll contribute questions for the group. Don't forget, we'll see Harbor from the Holocaust Tuesday evening. It's the 8th at 10 o'clock on WQED TV and across the country on PBS stations. Welcome to Betty Ho Carlson, the granddaughter of Dr. Feng Chan Ho, the Chinese Schindler. Ilana Diamond, Managing Director of Innovation Works, which puts Pittsburgh on the map, the startup map. Ilana is the great niece of Lucy Hartwich, the principal of the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association School. The school preserved Jewish tradition and language. Dr. Michelle Ferrier is here, the consulting producer and advisor for Harbor from the Holocaust. She is the founder of the Confucius Institute at the University of Pittsburgh, where she teaches Asian studies. Iris Sampson, co-producer of Harbor from the Holocaust. Iris has relatives who spent time in Shanghai, and Iris is a beloved colleague at WQED and an Emmy award-winning producer. Welcome, everybody. Delighted to have you here. Much of the initial inspiration for the film is rooted right here in Pittsburgh. Betty, it is your grandfather, Ho Feng Shan, who is credited with helping so many people leave Austria, and Ilana, your great aunt, who was principal of the Kadori School. I'm curious, though, to hear from you. Dr. Ferrier, how has this story emerged in both the US and China?
So this was a story that actually was sort of well known in Asia and other parts of the Jewish community, but I don't think it had a sort of global understanding of the intersection of the two theaters of war, what was going on in Europe and what was going on in Asia. And there's never been a story that sort of linked the two together and showed sort of the human cost of those two wars. And this particular story came about because I was out at UCLA and I saw this exhibition, and my good friend Susan Jane Pertel, who is a director at UCLA in Asian Studies, encouraged me to then help her launch it nationally and send this story and these storyboards across the US. So our feeling was that we really needed an opportunity to tell this story more broadly about this 18,000 Jews that were able to survive the Holocaust by being harbored in Shanghai. It's just not that well known. Actually, in fact, Pittsburgh is remarkable. And meeting Ilana and Betty have been just such an incredible inspiration for us to then take this to this, level of bringing it to the masses through this film.
It's amazing, isn't it, that we know Oscar Schindler from Spielberg and Schindler's List, but now with this PBS program, this story is going to be much more broadly known. Betty Ho Carlson, what a treasured story to have in your family, but I understand you didn't learn of your grandfather's connection to the story until more recent years. Tell us what you recall about your grandfather. Any memories, please?
Actually, I knew my grandfather for more than half my life. I was very fortunate that way. But even he didn't speak about what he did in Austria. I think mostly because he was a very moral and he kind of lived his life by example, and he was a very moral and upright person. I think he felt that more people should have done what he did. In his autobiography, in fact, it's over 700 pages long, he spoke of what he did for the Jews in only pretty much one sentence. He said that he used every means possible to help the Jews. And it pretty much sums up his life. I mean, if you knew my grandfather, you could see he lived by example. And I feel privileged to know him, but I find it hard to explain. I don't talk about what he did, not because I'm not proud of what he did, but he never spoke about it during his entire lifetime. We found out about it after he passed. He carried himself well. He lived by example. Ironically, we were in China honoring him on what would have been his 100th birthday, and I happened to be in Shanghai in a Starbucks, ironic, and I came across a flyer about the Chinese Schindler. I can send it on in a picture later, and it talks about what my grandfather did. He was honored later posthumously in Israel for the works that he did. If I could take a moment, I'd like to share a little story about Robert Sokol, who was in Vienna. He fled for Shanghai in 1938 when he was 12. He subsequently, in Shanghai, met a Chinese girl whom he fell in love with. And eventually, he got a scholarship to study in Chicago. En route from China to the United States to study, he became friends with a young man named Montojo, and they became very good friends. And Montojo was my father. So if my grandfather hadn't given the Sokol family visas, he would have never met my father. So that kind of went full circle.
Oh, it's wonderful. And of course, today in Vienna, there's a plaque that remembers your grandfather, Betty. Now, Ilana, did you know how significant a role your aunt played in the lives of children in Shanghai? Have you had contact with her students over the years?
Are you asking me?
Okay.
There we
So
are.
growing up, I'd always heard that my aunt had been the principal of a school in Shanghai, but because my mother's entire family had been refugees, they'd been all over the world, and I didn't really understand the magnitude of it until I would say I was in my 20s probably, and they had a reunion in San Francisco with some of the students that she taught, and the stories people told, and you know, they told stories of such courage. There was a time when they put on a play that I believe they spoke about in the movie that we saw. They put on a Purim play, and it's the story of a dictator who really harms the Jews, and one of the Japanese military folks was there overseeing things, and for some reason he thought it was about him. And they ended up arresting my aunt. And so I would grow up hearing stories like that. Then serendipitously, in the mid 80s, my husband and I traveled to China, and we bought an old map and put it on top of a new map in Shanghai and went looking for Jewish places. And when we were looking for the synagogue, we ran into another American couple, and there weren't many people traveling in China in the 80s. And it turned out that his father, who was a rabbi, had been in Shanghai and been a student of my aunt. And he'd heard all his life about my Aunt Lucy. So I have met some of her students, and I think it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized how special she was.
Oh my, we already have a lot of questions, so we'll try to pick up the tempo a little bit, but I want to ask Iris, you actually were aware of the story when you began working on the project. What did you know, and did your understanding of the story change during the production?
Absolutely, completely. My husband's mother is a Holocaust survivor, and a lot of members of his family are Holocaust survivors. And when we talked about Shanghai, he said, oh my goodness, 3 of my uncles spent the war years in Shanghai. They were from the famed Mir Yeshiva, which is a school of higher Jewish learning. And they spent the war years in Shanghai. So I knew that Jews had been there, but I didn't know the extent of the story, that actually the Jewish community in Shanghai goes back 150 years, Baghdadi Jews who ended up settling there, and then Russian Jews that came at the turn of the century, and then the Jews that came from Austria and from Germany and from Poland in the 30s and early 40s. So yeah, everything was new to me.
And Dr. Ferrier, what do you think is the greatest takeaway from the documentary?
Oh, well, I think no doubt it's what Daryl said earlier, and that is that this story really brings to light the importance of harboring refugees, how critical it is to future generations. You don't have to scratch the surface too deeply here to understand what's going on globally with immigrants all around the world, particularly people fleeing persecution, and that to open our doors and hearts to people who are suffering and leaving their countries under dire circumstances. I think this story has a real contemporary sort of feel to it at the end. It is a story of Jewish Holocaust and persecution, but it is also a story of how people pull together as human beings and as good, fine folk to do the right thing, stand up, whether it was Ho Fenshang giving out the visas or Alana's aunt creating this school and making the traditions of Judaism live on in a foreign country. I mean, these are really critical lessons that we bring forth into our own circumstances today. And I think in that there's no way to watch the film and not come away with a sense of what we should do for one another as humanitarians.
Just very quickly for the group, anything you'd like to add? How has seeing the story changed or broadened your view of this chapter in history? Just very quickly, we have lots of questions from friends who've joined us, but anything you'd like to add about how the story has changed or broadened our view of history? Who's going to go first here? Please. Any extra comments?
One of the things that I found fascinating is there were a lot of very strong women that were very vital to this story, from Lucy Hartwich to Laura Margolis from the Joint, who kept people alive by running soup kitchens and going head to head with the Japanese occupation force there. So I think it's really a wonderful testament to the strength that the women at that time had as well. So that was, I think, another nice little side story.
The other thing that jumped out at me was how the Chinese people, as little as they had and as poor as they were, and as difficult as their situation was, made more difficult by adding thousands of refugees into their lives, they still kept their arms open and their hearts open. And I think, as Dr. Ferrier said, and also Daryl said, you know, it's a lesson for us today.
Now, which Jews were able to take the escape option? Was it based on their location?
So you're asking coming out of Vienna? Is any, so the Viennese Jews happen to have somebody in the Chinese embassy giving out visas. That's why there were that group that came out of Vienna. But there were other diplomats in other cities throughout Europe giving out visas in a very similar way, particularly a Japanese gentleman who did it.
Sugihara.
Back.
I mean, I think that was a big question. That
your grandfather was significant. I mean, there's no question. I'm not diminishing that, but there were a number of people who are sort of unsung heroes in this that created opportunity for people to be able to get out. So
I think a lot of people ask me that question too, is why would someone Chinese help Viennese people, especially issuing visas to China? And that's also a confusion I think people ask sometimes too. These are not exit visas, they're entry visas. Because of the agreement at Evian, where all the countries, or 32 countries, had quotas as to how many people that they would allow in each country. That's where my grandfather sort of stepped beyond his boundaries and just issued visas and ignored the quotas, but they're entry visas to China. And really it's just a stamp in a passport. But with that stamp, with the visa, it enabled people to get, or the Viennese to get, a ticket to leave Nazi occupied Vienna. And that's all they needed. Certainly, I don't think my grandfather felt that people would necessarily go to China, but it enabled them to leave Nazi occupied Vienna. Now, granted, a lot of people, as this story shows, did ultimately end up in Shanghai, which was an open port at the time, where you didn't need all kinds of paper to get in. But it just shows that if you have a good moral fiber or a good heart, that you can just help someone leave such a horrible situation. Because at the time, There were lines that were blocks long of people that were desperate. I mean, around all of the consulates, not just the Chinese consulate, but all of the consulates, of people just desperate to get any visa, entry visa, to go to any country, just to leave Nazi occupied territories.
And Ilana, I want to ask you, did you ever find the school building? And if so, what's become of the school building?
So I don't know what it is today, but I can tell you in 1988-ish, when we found the school building, people were playing basketball in it. So at that point, it hadn't been really preserved. It was kind of they gave classes there and kids were playing sports. I think today it has been preserved and it's a cultural center of a sort, but I haven't been back. And that actually is exactly where we met the son of this rabbi.
Now, here's a question from Eric. Eric wants to know how or where did you find that amazing historical footage from Shanghai and the Jewish community? Maybe Iris would fill us in.
Thank you. Yeah, the two main sources that we used was the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has an amazing archives. It's the Steven Spielberg archives, and they have footage from all over the world, but especially a lot of very good European footage. And then the American Joint Distribution Committee, which you saw in the 20-minute segment, they had people on the ground there with probably thousands of photographs of that time, and also a little bit of film of that time. And then, of course, the main source that we always go to here at QED is the National Archives, because it belongs to all of us. It's a public service, and you can use the footage from there. So that's primarily where the main three sources.
One of our viewers wants to know, is there any Jewish community left in Shanghai? And here's another question. Will we learn more about the Pittsburgh connection here? How and why did some of these folks get here? Whoever would like to take those questions on.
So I can briefly address the Jewish community in China. There is a Jewish community in China. It's very small. It's very sporadic. They do allow houses of worship there. It's government controlled. It's a little bit, it's not wide open, but there are Jews that live there because there's a lot of business and a lot of various expat communities that live in Shanghai and Beijing and other cities as well. I wouldn't say that it's a thriving Jewish community so much as it's supported within the community there, and it's difficult to explain in 5 seconds or less religious tolerance in China. It's tolerated for foreigners and not so much for the local constituents. So it's a difficult thing to sort of say in a soundbite. They do exist. I have to be very clear with you that the Pittsburgh connection is one of the most remarkable things. The box of photos and assets that Ilana gave us was just like this magic key that opened up an entire world towards the Kadoorie School that those photos and what she had almost don't exist anywhere else in the world. That her aunt left with a box of photos was a very significant thing to launch this film and have those original assets be a part of it. And if you think about it, Jim, when the Jews left Shanghai, they entered with nothing and they left with very little. So there aren't a lot of photos and there aren't a lot of assets or archaeological pieces that exist, not in China, and because of the revolution and all of that was wiped out, and not in other parts of the world either. So this box of assets was a remarkable find.
And Iris, I know you have family ties direct to Shanghai.
Yeah, but I wanted to say something about the local ties. I don't know if this is a good place. We are actually working on a half-hour local production that's going to include interviews with Ilana and her late mother, talking about Lucy Hartwich, and with Betty. We had interviewed Betty, and she's part of this. And we found we found a survivor, a man who was born in the Shanghai ghetto who lives in Pittsburgh. And we found the son of a man who was part of the Mir Yeshiva, who was also here in Pittsburgh. So you'll get sort of the local story, the local flavor, from that when that airs. And what Michelle was just saying about finding the trove, you know, so many people left and they had nothing. But one of the gentlemen that I interviewed had probably 5 or 6 photo albums full of pictures. He had the Shanghai Jewish Chronicle, which is the newspaper of that time. And you know, just seeing these things and touching these things, it's amazing because you're touching history, but it's living. And that's, I think, one of the things that you get from this is that this is real, this happened, people lived through this period of time, and they came out sometimes much stronger on the other side.
Just a few seconds, please, on the music. It's so moving, wonderful music. And to have Yo-Yo Ma involved, you had an original score, you have Chinese traditional music. More about the music, please.
Oh, well, Shad Cannon is the, so Violet Dufang, who is our director and producer, found Chad Cannon, who had done some other beautiful works. I think one of the last things he did was the score to Mulan. And so he scored the entire film. And then it turned out Daryl was able to make the connection with Yo-Yo Ma and the family. Yo-Yo Ma performs a composition by his father in this production. And so it makes it, to me, the music is just so evocative and so beautifully attached to this. I think you can't watch it without having the music just kind of set the whole mood for you.
Okay, Nina has asked who was responsible for writing the script and pulling together all of the photos and video into the film. Was it you, Iris?
Well, Lynn Squilla and Lynn and Betty actually have a connection. Lynn was our writer, although Violet also really wrote the script. So the two of them worked together on that. And then there's another Ilana Diamond, who was our production assistant.
Yes.
Right, it's very funny.
And of course, this is Pittsburgh, so I know her. She went to camp with my daughter.
So she helped track down a lot of the footage as well. And then I have to give a plug for Frank Caliero, who was one of the 2 directors of photography, but he did most of the stuff in the United States, and he just did a beautiful job.
Wonderful. Is there a Chinese monument to your grandfather, Betty, in China? Has the Chinese government officially recognized maybe someone?
My grandfather and actually my grandmother are buried there. So there's a huge kind of, I want to say mausoleum, but not quite. They're buried there. And so people traditionally go and clean their graves, and there is a museum there in Changsha, where he's originally from, and which is why my family was there to celebrate what would have been his 100th birthday. And so there is a museum, and he's been honored in China.
And once the Jews were herded into the ghetto, were they still tormented by the Japanese, or were they pretty much left alone at that point?
Are you asking me?
Perhaps Dr. Ferrier knows, I don't know.
So I think that, you know, the foreign concessions of Shanghai all had some very particular problems associated with them. And obviously the Japanese were in charge of Hangzhou, which was the neighborhood that they were given before they took over all of Shanghai. And so I think life in that situation was very difficult for people, but it's to me a part of the overall suffering. So in that particular neighborhood, Chinese and the Jews were all equally suffering. No one had anything, and it was a war. It was a war experience. So it was a very difficult place to live and try to survive, whether it was the Chinese nationalists that were in charge or the Japanese forces. The reason Shanghai was a place that allowed foreigners in was no one was really in charge of the harbor. No one was in charge of letting people in or not at the time where the Jews started coming in. It wasn't so much that it was wide open, it was that no one was kind of overseeing this influx. And there was a structure of a Jewish community that were able to originally host the Jewish refugees. So when they were herded into the Japanese ghetto, I think life was difficult to begin with, and it certainly got worse. And then, but in another side story, the Japanese were asked by the Germans to annihilate that neighborhood at one point, and the Japanese refused to. So there is a story of a lot of suffering. And there was also this other story where the Japanese refused to annihilate the Jews that were in that neighborhood at one point. And then they left, and then the Jews left. So, but I think it was not a good situation for anybody at that point. It was a lot of suffering, a lot of difficult, it was just a lot of difficulties that war brings.
One of our folks with us, Gail, wanted to know about the relationships that developed along the way with the folks thrown together under unusual circumstances, the friendships, and was there marriage between the Chinese and the Jews in Shanghai?
There were a number of people that had intercultural marriages and were quite successful. Some of them stayed in Shanghai after the Japanese occupation. Some emigrated to other countries. I think there's a very large piece in the film where people talk about those friendships. The Chinese and the Westerners, the Jews, talk about their friendships with the Chinese. Again, the Chinese and the Jews were all suffering under the war. And so there was this sort of thread of, compassion for one another to get through a really difficult situation. And yes, there were romances. If you were to visit the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum in Hangzhou, which exists, which is the former synagogue, it is now a museum. It has a wonderful wall with all the names of the Jews that lived there. You will see stories in parts of the museum about people who married and their wedding dresses and photos from that. So it absolutely happened.
Well, and also, in fact, when you watch the film on Tuesday night at 10 o'clock, you'll see we have an interview with a gentleman whose father married. His father was, I believe, German, and married a Chinese woman. Both of them were deaf. And that's a beautiful side story to this documentary. So I think that that's something everybody can enjoy as well, and see it actually, that it actually did happen.
Because we're getting down to our last couple of minutes here, I throw together a couple of questions. Anyone can jump in on who was the reader of the letters. Iris, you might be able to tell us about that. And Jeff wants to know how.
What? Okay.
Frozen.
The reader of the letters we have hired an actress for that. So, but she was reading from a very famous book that Violet and Lynn adapted some portions of.
And after that, it froze.
Uh-oh. Mark it on.
Oh, we lost him.
Okay, so what was the other question? So we, maybe, Ilana, maybe you can tell us how you came about finding those photos. Where were they?
They belonged to my aunt, who left them to my grandmother. And when my grandmother passed, I happened to find it as I was going through things, and I just couldn't believe them. I just couldn't believe it. And so nobody else actually really wanted them, but I really wanted them. And in it was my aunt's exit visa and hundreds and hundreds of photos. And actually that's how I got connected with all of you, because Cassandra Pan, my friend who's involved with the board at WQED, I was telling her this story because she was going to China. And then Daryl told her that they were putting together this project, and that they'd heard there was the granddaughter of Lucy Hartwich, but in Pittsburgh, but they didn't know who it was. They'd heard it through the grapevine. And she said, I know who that is. And that's how I got connected to all of you and was able to share those wonderful photos, which are just amazing.
Now, I see that Jim has been called away. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank everybody who's been on the panel. We could not have done this without you. Each one of you has a very important part of this, and it's an honor and a privilege for us to be able to present you tonight. And as a final remark, don't forget to watch WQED, or if you're watching from outside of this area, your local PBS station. The program will be on Tuesday, September 8th at 10 o'clock. So we hope to see you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be on.